The emerald flare light hammered the coast, exposing Japanese assault chains as they funneled through the breaking surf toward the mouth of the Ilu River. This single sandbar was the only lock on the gateway to Henderson Field, the strategic heart of the entire Solomon's campaign. 21-year-old Al Schmid leaned his weight into the spade grips. His palms vibrated with the mechanical strain of the water-cooled .30. He held the trigger. A grenade flash filled the pit with a sudden crimson warmth, crushing the surrounding jungle into a flickering void. The heat of the cooling jacket mirrored the searing steel of the Philadelphia furnaces left behind. And it all started from here. The air inside the Dodge Steel Company tasted of ozone and burnt iron, a thick metallic haze that clung to the back of a man's throat until he washed it away with a cold beer at the end of a shift. 21-year-old Albert Schmid moved with the easy, practiced rhythm of a Philadelphia kid who had been on his own since his mother passed. As an apprentice burner, his world was one of white-hot sparks and the steady hiss of the torch. He was a cheerful sort, his face a map of freckles and soot, well-liked by the older hands who saw in him the grit of a true Philadelphian. When the shift ended, he would leave the roar of the furnaces behind, crossing the Delaware River toward the Tacony-Palmyra Bridge, heading home to a row house on Tulip Street. Al didn't have a place of his own. He lived with Jim Merchant and his wife, Ella May. It was a modest arrangement, the kind born of the Great Depression's long shadow where friends became family by necessity. It was through the Merchants that he had met Ruth Hartley. She worked at the Sears department store, a girl with a quick smile whom Al affectionately called Babs. He was a man of big talk and easy laughter, often regaling her with grand plans, though deep down he was content with the simple warmth of a Sunday afternoon and the promise of a date. Sunday, December 7th, 1941, began as any other day of rest. Al was sprawled out on the floor of the Merchant's living room, the Sunday paper scattered around him in a messy heap of ink and newsprint. He was procrastinating, trying to find the ambition to trade his comfortable spot for a suit and a tie for his evening with Ruth. The radio in the corner was a low hum of big band dance music, providing a soft backdrop to the quiet Philadelphia afternoon. Then the music stopped. It wasn't the usual pause for a commercial break. There was a crackle of static, a moment of hollow silence, and then a voice, urgent and strained, broke through the airwaves. The announcer spoke of a place Al had never heard of. The Japanese had attacked a naval base at Pearl Harbor. Al sat up, frowning. He reached out and twisted the dial, the plastic knob clicking as he searched for another station. "The joke," he muttered to the empty room. Some kind of Orson Welles stunt. But the next station carried the same frantic report, then the next. The words war and infamy began to knit together into a terrifying reality. "Hey, Jim!" Al shouted toward the kitchen. "Jim, the radio keeps saying there's a war with Japan. Where the hell is Pearl Harbor?" He didn't wait for an answer that made sense. The world had shifted on its axis, but the habits of a Philadelphia Sunday were hard to break. He got dressed, his mind a whirlpool of confusion and rising adrenaline, and went to pick up Ruth. They went ice skating that night. Under the pale glow of the rink lights, as their skates hissed against the frozen surface, Al kept the news to himself. He wanted one last hour where the world was just the two of them and the cold winter air. It wasn't until he walked her home later that evening that Ruth learned the world had caught fire while they were dancing on the ice. In the days that followed, the city of Philadelphia transformed. The casual atmosphere of the neighborhoods was replaced by a grim, purposeful energy. Al talked to Ruth about enlisting, but she brushed it off. He was always talking big, she reminded him, always looking for the next adventure. But on December 9th, 1941, the big talk stopped. "I'm in," he told her, his voice devoid of its usual playfulness. "I went down to the custom house and signed up." He had chosen the Marines. There was something about the reputation of the Corps, the toughest, the first to go, that appealed to the burner from Dodge Steel. If there was a fire to be put out, Al Schmid wanted to be at the heart of the flame. January 5th, 1942, marked the end of his life as a civilian. He boarded a train headed south, leaving the familiar skyline of Philadelphia for the humid, sand-blown grit of Parris Island, South Carolina. Recruit training was a brutal awakening. The island was a machine designed to break a man down to his core and rebuild him with a foundation of steel and discipline. Al learned the intricate language of the .30 caliber water-cooled machine gun. He learned that a Marine's life depended on his squad, and his squad's life depended on the mechanical reliability of their weapon and the steady hand of the man behind the trigger. From Parris Island, he moved to Ilu River, North Carolina, for further combat training. He was no longer the freckle-faced kid from Burholm. He was a leatherneck, part of the 11th Machine Gun Squad, Company H, 2nd Battalion, 1st Regiment of the 1st Marine Division. He was leaner, his movements more deliberate, his eyes carrying the weight of the destination unknown that everyone knew was coming. Before the division was ordered to deploy, Al was granted a short leave. He returned to Philadelphia, a city that now felt smaller, quieter. He went back to the Dodge Steel Company one last time to collect a bonus he had earned for his labor in 1941. With the crumpled bills in his pocket, he walked to a jeweler and bought an engagement ring for Ruth. It was a modest spark of light against the gathering darkness of the Pacific War. He didn't ask her to marry him then. He didn't want to leave her a widow before she was a wife, but he gave her the ring as a promise. "Keep this," he told her. "I'm coming back to put it on your finger for real." The departure was sudden. Al boarded the troop transport George F. Elliott, a gray ghost of a ship that smelled of diesel, salt, and the nervous sweat of 10,000 men. As the ship pulled away from the pier, Al stood at the rail, watching the American coastline dissolve into the mist. He was a cog in the largest Marine force ever assembled for landing operations, commanded by Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift. They were headed for a place called Guadalcanal, a speck of jungle in the Solomon Islands that few Americans could find on a map. The strategic stakes were absolute. The Japanese were building an airfield there that could sever the lifeline between the United States and Australia. If the Marines didn't take it, the Pacific would be lost. As the Elliott churned through the vast empty reaches of the ocean, Al Schmid spent his hours stripping and reassembling his machine gun. He memorized every spring, every pin, every cooling jacket. He practiced the rhythm of loading belts in the dark, his fingers learning to see what his eyes could not. He was no longer a burner of steel. He was a practitioner of its most lethal application. The boy from Tulip Street was gone, replaced by a sergeant of Marines, sailing toward a humid green hell where the only thing that mattered was the man to his left, the man to his right, and the cold, heavy weight of the .30 caliber gun that would soon become his entire world. The 7th of August 1942 did not begin with the expected roar of 1,000 Japanese guns, but with an eerie, suffocating silence. As the 10,000 men of the 1st Marine Division surged toward the emerald shoreline of Guadalcanal, Albert Schmid felt the heavy thrum of the Higgins boat's engine vibrating through the soles of his boots. He gripped the heavy tripod of his machine gun, his knuckles white against the dark metal. Beside him, Corporal Leroy Diamond and Private First Class John Rivers stood like statues, their faces smeared with a mixture of sweat and camouflage grease. They had prepared for a slaughter on the sand, a wall of fire to meet them at the water's edge. Yet when the ramps dropped, the only enemy they faced was the oppressive, wet heat of the Solomon Islands. The first 2 weeks on the island were a deceptive peace that gnawed at a man's nerves more than a direct assault ever could. The Marines moved inland, carving a perimeter through the prehistoric tangle of the jungle. To Al, the green hell was a far cry from the soot-stained brick of Philadelphia. Here, the air was a thick soup of decaying vegetation and salt spray. Every step was an invitation for a boot to be swallowed by black muck and every night was a symphony of alien shrieks and the relentless drone of mosquitoes. They occupied the Henderson Field airstrip, but the expected counterattack remained a ghost, whispered about in the ranks but never materializing.
"It's too quiet, Smitty," John Rivers muttered one afternoon as they sat near their gear, wiping the persistent moisture from the ammunition belts.
Rivers was a quiet man, possessing a stillness that Al respected. "They're out there, just watching us rot in this heat." Al didn't look up from the cooling jacket of their .30 caliber machine gun. He was obsessed with the weapon. He knew that the water-cooled M1917A1 was a temperamental beast. If the hose leaked or the water boiled off too fast, the barrel would warp and they would be left with nothing but useless iron. "Let them watch," Al replied, his voice a low rasp. "We're digging in. If they want this strip of dirt back, they're going to have to pay for every yard." By the middle of August, the atmosphere changed. Intelligence reports began to filter down through the command of Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift. A crack Japanese Army regiment, led by the formidable Colonel Kiyono Ichiki, had landed at Taivu Point to the east. They were elite troops, veterans of the campaigns in China, and they were marching west with a singular, bloody purpose: to retake the airfield and drive the Marines into the sea. The 11th Machine Gun Squad was ordered to the west bank of the Ilu River. Due to a mapping error that would haunt the campaign's history, the officers called it the Tenaru, but the water that flowed sluggishly toward the ocean was the Ilu. The river was approximately 50 yards wide at the point where Al's squad was told to hold the line. It was a natural choke point, a shallow sandbar at the river's mouth, providing the only clear passage for an infantry charge. For 3 days, Al, Diamond, and Rivers labored like pack mules. They dug a deep pit into the soft, sandy loam of the bank, reinforcing the walls with heavy logs and sandbags until it felt like a subterranean fortress. They draped the position in a thick canopy of palm fronds and jungle greenery, blending the nest into the shadows of the tree line. Inside, the .30 caliber gun sat on its tripod, its nose pointed across the dark water toward the dense thicket of the opposite bank. Corporal Diamond, the veteran of the trio, moved with a grim efficiency. He spent hours pacing the sector, measuring distances to various landmarks: a fallen coconut tree, a cluster of mangrove roots, a bend in the stream. 300 yards to that stump, Diamond noted, his voice devoid of emotion. 400 to the clearing. Smitty, I want you to memorize the feel of the traverse. If the flares go up, you don't want to be guessing where the bank starts. Al nodded, his hands moving over the spade grips of the gun. He practiced the talking rhythm of the trigger, short, controlled bursts that saved ammunition and kept the barrel from overheating. Between the labor and the drills, there was a heavy, shared silence. They didn't talk much about home anymore. Philadelphia, Ruth, the steel mills. Those things felt like fragments of a dream Al had once had in a different life. Here, the only reality was the smell of gun oil and the weight of the grenades clipped to their webbing. On the evening of August 20th, the tension finally snapped. The air felt heavy, charged with the static of an impending storm. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion was on high alert. Word had come down that Ichiki's force was close, very close. The Marines could hear the distant clatter of equipment from across the river, the faint, rhythmic sound of 1,000 men moving through the brush. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and blood oranges, Al sat in the bottom of the nest. He took out the engagement ring he had bought for Ruth, the small diamond catching the last of the light. He didn't look at it for long. He couldn't afford the distraction of hope. He tucked it back into his pocket and stood up, checking the water level in the gun's cooling jacket one last time. "Tonight's the night," Rivers said softly, sliding a fresh belt of ammunition into the breech. "Yeah," Al replied. He checked the action, the metallic clack-clack of the bolt sounding unnaturally loud in the evening stillness. "Make sure the spare belts are dry. If this thing jams when they hit the water, we're done for."
Diamond sat on the edge of the pit, his eyes fixed on the opposite bank. They'll come at us with everything. Ichiki doesn't believe in retreating. He'll send them in waves. We hold the trigger until the barrel melts. You hear me?
I hear you, Corporal, Al said. He settled himself behind the gun, his boots finding purchase in the dirt. He felt a strange, cold calm wash over him. The apprenticeship at the steel mill had taught him how to handle heat and pressure, but this was a different kind of forge. Tonight he wasn't a burner of steel. He was the steel itself.
The moon rose, casting a silver, ghostly pall over the Ilu River. The water looked like mercury, slow and thick. In the jungle across the way, the Japanese were silent now, but the silence was predatory. Al checked his watch. It was nearing midnight. He reached out and touched the cooling jacket of the gun. It was cold to the touch, but he knew that within hours it would be boiling. He adjusted his helmet, felt the grit of the sand on his skin, and waited. The 2 weeks of deceptive peace were over. Somewhere in the dark, Colonel Ichiki was drawing his sword, and the boy from Philadelphia was the only thing standing in his way. The clock in the back of Albert Schmidt's mind had stopped ticking sometime around midnight, replaced by the heavy rhythmic thumping of his own heart against his ribs. It was 3 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of August, 1942. The darkness over the Ilu River was absolute, a thick velvet curtain that seemed to press the very breath back into a man's lungs. Al sat in the mud of the machine gun nest, his hands resting lightly on the spade grips of the M1917A1. The steel was cool, but the air around it felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike on the Philadelphia skyline. Beside him, Johnny Rivers was a silent shadow, and Corporal Leroy Diamond was a presence of grim, unmoving stone. Then, the world turned a nauseating shade of emerald. A Japanese flare hissed into the sky, bursting with a pop that echoed off the jungle walls. The light was sickly and green, casting long dancing shadows that flickered across the 50 yards of dark water separating the Marines from the enemy. In that ghost light, Al saw them. At first it looked like a herd of cattle, a dark, bobbing mass of shapes emerging from the dense tree line on the opposite bank. They were silent, a shifting tide of helmets and bayonets, moving with a terrifying collective purpose toward the water's edge. "Here they come," Diamond whispered, his voice like grinding gravel. The silence didn't last. As the first Japanese boots hit the shallow water of the river, the air shattered. A cacophony of screams erupted from the darkness, shrill, piercing cries of "Banzai!" and "Marine, tonight you die!" The psychological weight of the noise was designed to paralyze, to turn the blood of the defenders to ice. But Al felt only a sudden, sharp tightening in his chest, a clarity born of adrenaline. Johnny Rivers didn't wait. He leaned into the gun, and the .30 caliber water-cooled machine gun began its terrible work. Chug, 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 chug. The muzzle flashes were rhythmic, blinding bursts of orange that seared the retina. The heavy tripod, nearly 50 pounds of iron and steel, bucked against the soft earth, but Rivers held it true. Across the river, the herd of cattle broke apart. The screaming intensified, but now the cries were of agony and rage. The Japanese concentrated their fire on the nest, the air suddenly filled with the angry whine of lead. Bullets tore into the sandbags, throwing wet mud and wood chips into Al's face. The smell of cordite, sharp and sulphurous, flooded the pit, mixing with the metallic tang of the river water and the rot of the jungle. "They're hitting the right!" Diamond yelled over the roar. Al looked to his right and saw the flashes of another machine gun position 150 yards downstream. Suddenly that gun went silent. A hail of Japanese bullets had found its mark. The pressure on their own position doubled. A string of tracers like glowing red finger paint streaked toward them. Al ducked as a burst of fire raked the top of their log and sandbag roof.
When he looked up, the world had changed again.
Johnny River's head snapped back. A dozen bullets, a concentrated burst from a Japanese light machine gun had caught him full in the face. He didn't scream. He didn't even moan. He simply fell back into the mud of the trench, his lifeless finger frozen on the trigger. The gun continued to bark, sending 200 rounds of hot lead screaming into the darkness of the river before the belt finally ran dry. A cold white rage washed over Al, drowning out the fear. It was a feeling he recognized from the steel mills, the moment when the furnace boiled over and you either mastered the heat or let it consume you. He shoved River's heavy, limp body out of the way, ignoring the warmth of his friend's blood on his hands. He slid into the seat behind the gun. Diamond was already there, his hands moving with frantic precision as he cleared the spent casing and prepared to feed a new 250-round belt into the breech.
"I've got it!"
Al roared. "Load it, Diamond! Just keep it feeding!" Al squeezed the trigger. The vibration traveled up his arms, rattling his teeth and shaking his very soul. Through the sights he saw the Japanese officer, a shadow among shadows, his voice a shrill, barking command that rose above the din of the battle. Al swung the gun's traverse, raking the tree line. He heard the officer's voice cut short, replaced by the frantic babble of his men. The gun was a living thing now, a thirsty, roaring beast that Al had to tame. Diamond was hit next. A bullet tore through his arm, the force of the impact knocking him across Al's feet. He let out a grunt of pain but didn't stop. He couldn't load the belts with one hand, but he could still see. He stood beside Al, his good arm pointing into the dark, his voice screaming directions into Al's ear over the deafening clatter of the weapon.
"Left! Left! They're in the water, 50 yards! Now, right! Put it on the sandbar!"
Al fired blindly where Diamond pointed. He felt the heavy thud of Diamond's hand on his shoulder, a physical signal to swing the gun. Every time he raked the water, he heard the screams. The Japanese were trying to cross the sandbar, a narrow strip of land where the Ilu met the sea. It was a kill zone. The bodies were piling up so high in the shallow water that the following waves of soldiers had to climb over their own dead to reach the marine bank. The heat in the nest became unbearable. The water in the gun's cooling jacket was boiling, steam hissing from the overflow hose like a cornered viper. Suddenly, a burst of Japanese fire punctured the water jacket. Boiling water spurted out, drenching Al's lap and chest. The pain was sharp, but he barely felt it. The gun crackled and began to overheat, the barrel glowing a dull, dangerous red in the darkness. But it didn't jam. Al kept firing, his thumbs raw, his vision a blur of flashes and smoke. He was now loading and firing the gun himself, a feat of mechanical dexterity that seemed impossible in the chaos. When he reached the end of a belt, Diamond would punch his arm. Al would fire a final burst, rip open the magazine cover, yank the new belt through, and slam the cover shut. The rhythm was the only thing that kept him sane. Fire, load, swing. Fire, load, swing. 4 hours passed in a montage of terror. The Japanese were relentless. They were the elite of the Imperial Army, men who had never known defeat, and they threw themselves at the Marine line with a suicidal fervor. Somehow, amidst the hundreds of men falling in the river, one Japanese soldier managed to crawl through the body-choked stream. He got close, hidden by the smoke and the shadows of the bank, and lobbed a hand grenade into the nest. Al saw a small dark object tumble over the sandbags. There was no time to react, no time to pray. A blinding white flash consumed the world. The explosion was a physical weight that slammed Al backward, knocking his helmet off and throwing him against the rear wall of the pit. For a moment, there was no sound. Only a high-pitched, ringing hum that seemed to vibrate inside his skull. Al reached up to his face. All he felt was the slick, hot sensation of raw flesh and the thick, iron scent of his own blood. "They got me in the eyes," he muttered, the words sounding distant and hollow. "Diamond,
They got my eyes. He collapsed on his back, the darkness of the night now permanent. But the battle wasn't over. The Japanese were still pouring fire into the hole, their bullets thudding into the logs just inches above his head. Al felt a surge of defiant Philadelphia grit. He reached for his holster, his fingers fumbling until they wrapped around the checkered grip of his .45 caliber automatic. He racked the slide, the sound crisp even through the ringing in his ears. Diamond, lying wounded beside him, heard the metallic click.
Don't do it, Smitty! Don't shoot yourself!
Hell, don't worry about that, Al spat, his voice thick with blood. I'm going to get the first Jap that tries to come in here. Just tell me which way he's coming from, and I'll get him. The two men lay there in the mud and the blood of their friends, helpless but unbowed. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, Al took his position again. He couldn't see the river, couldn't see the sandbar, and couldn't see the hundreds of dead men clogging the Ilu. But he crawled back to the machine gun, feeling for the spade grips. With Diamond screaming directions into his ear telling him where the shadows were moving, Al Schmid began to fire again. He fired at a world he could no longer see, his finger clamped on the trigger, a blind sentinel standing guard over the line until the last of a Cheeky's regiment lay silent in the rising sun. The dawn of the 21st of August, 1942 did not bring the warmth of the sun, but a cold gray light that peeled back the shadows of the Ilu River to reveal a landscape of absolute slaughter. For Albert Schmid, the transition from night to morning was not a visual one. The world had been reduced to a cacophony of sound, a geography of pain and the thick, suffocating scent of iron and stagnant water. He lay in the bottom of the machine gun nest, his back against the vibrating earth. Every heartbeat sent a fresh wave of white-hot needles through his optic nerves, but he kept his fingers curled around the grip of his .45 caliber automatic. The darkness behind his eyelids was permanent now, a heavy, airless void. Yet his mind remained focused on the sounds of the struggle only a few yards away. The Japanese were not finished. Despite the hundreds of bodies already clogging the river, the remnants of Colonel Ichiki's unbeatable regiment were still probing the Marine line. The air was thick with the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of mortars and the sharp whip-crack snap of sniper fire. Above them, perched in the twisted limbs of a banyan tree across the river, a Japanese marksman was firing almost straight down into the pit. Each bullet hissed as it bit into the soft, rain-soaked logs of the shelf where the machine gun stood, a shelf only 2 feet in diameter that provided the only sliver of protection for the 2 broken men below. "He's still there," Corporal Leroy Diamond gasped, his voice thin and ragged from blood loss. He lay beside Al, his arm a mangled mess of shredded fatigues and raw meat. "A sniper. He's looking right down our throats, Schmid." Al shifted, feeling the grit of the sand and the slickness of Johnny River's blood beneath his palms. He couldn't see the tree, couldn't see the river, and couldn't see the sky. But he could hear. He could hear the distinct metallic clink of a bolt being cycled and the rustle of leaves 50 yards away. "Just tell me where," Al rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over broken glass. "Point my hand, Diamond. Tell me the hour on the clock, and I'll give him the whole magazine." Diamond reached out with his good hand, his fingers trembling as they gripped Al's wrist, guiding the heavy steel muzzle of the .45 toward the canopy across the water. 11 o'clock. High. Now. Al squeezed the trigger, the recoil jarring his wounded shoulder. He emptied the magazine into the green haze he could only imagine, the muzzle flashes invisible to him but surely bright to the enemy. The sniper's fire ceased for a moment, replaced by the frantic chatter of Japanese light machine guns further down the bank. The situation was critical. The 11th Machine Gun Squad was effectively shattered. John Rivers lay dead in the mud, and the 2 survivors were trapped in a shallow grave that the Japanese were determined to fill. The .30 caliber machine gun,
The weapon that had held the line through 4 hours of suicidal charges was a scorched, silent wreck. Its water jacket was riddled with holes, its internal mechanisms likely warped by the incredible heat of firing thousands of rounds without a pause. Then, through the ringing in his ears, Al heard a new sound, the heavy, splashing thud of boots in the mud and the frantic breathing of someone moving fast through the fire. "Stay down. Marine coming in," a voice barked. Private Whitey Jacobs, a member of the squad who had been caught in a nearby shell hole, lunged over the sandbags and into the nest. He landed hard, his chest heaving. He didn't waste time with questions. He saw the gore, the empty brass casings deep enough to bury a man's ankles, and the ruined faces of his friends. With a grim, professional efficiency, he began to work. He ripped open first aid kits, the sound of tearing fabric loud in the small space. He pressed thick gauze pads onto Al's face, trying to staunch the relentless flow of blood from the shell fragments that had shredded his eyes. "It's bad, Schmid," Jacobs whispered, his hands steady despite the sniper bullets still thudding into the logs above them. "But the line held. God, you should see the river. There isn't any water left, just uniforms and brass." As Jacobs worked, the tactical reality of the Battle of the Tenaroo, as the world would later call it, began to shift. Major General Vandegrift had seen enough. The Japanese had spent their strength against the point of the Marine's spear, and now it was time for the counterstroke. From behind the Marine positions, the low, guttural growl of tank engines began to rise, drowning out the sporadic rifle fire. The 2nd Marine Battalion's reserve was moving. Al felt the ground tremble as the light tanks and the fresh companies of infantry moved to cross the river further upstream. They were swinging around in a wide arc, a classic flanking maneuver designed to pin Ichiki's men against the sea. The sounds of the battle moved away from their little hole, becoming a distant rolling thunder of grenades and submachine gun fire. The hunters had become the hunted. "They're running, Al," Diamond said, his voice brimming with a hollow sort of triumph. "The boys are across. They're driving them back into the coconut groves." By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the slaughter was complete. Of the approximately 800 elite Japanese soldiers who had followed Colonel Ichiki across the sandbar, only 15 would remain alive to be accounted for. 14 were wounded, and only 1 was taken unhurt. The rest lay in the sun, a testament to the devastating power of the machine gun nest on the west bank. Colonel Ichiki, a man who had built a career on the myth of Japanese invincibility, had burned his regimental colors and ended his own life in the shade of the jungle he could not conquer. The cost to the Marines had been heavy, but in the vicinity of Al Schmidt's gun, the body count was staggering. Later reports would credit the position with over 200 enemy dead. The sandbar was no longer a geographical feature. It was a mass of tangled limbs and scorched earth. "We're getting you out of here, Schmid," Jacob said, his voice strained as he and another Marine began to unfold a heavy wool blanket to serve as a makeshift stretcher. They lifted Al gently, but the movement sent a fresh jolt of agony through his shattered face and shoulder. He felt himself being carried up out of the mud, the humid air of the Guadalcanal morning hitting his skin. He could hear the voices of officers, the clatter of equipment, and the distant, haunting screams of the wounded in the trees. As they carried him past the command post, Al heard a familiar voice, his lieutenant. The officer sounded exhausted, his words heavy with the weight of the night's losses. Al fumbled for his holster. His fingers found the cold, checkered grip of the .45 automatic. With a trembling hand, he reached out into the void, holding the weapon toward the sound of the lieutenant's voice. "I guess I won't be needing this anymore, sir," Al said. It was a simple statement, devoid of drama or self-pity. It was the report of a worker who had finished a long, grueling shift at the mill and was finally clocking out. The lieutenant took the heavy pistol, his hand briefly brushing Al's. "You did your job, Sergeant," the officer replied, his voice thick. "God knows
You did your job.
Al nodded, a small, painful movement. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the darkness was evaporating, replaced by a crushing, leaden fatigue. The sounds of Guadalcanal, the surf, the jungle, the receding echoes of the war began to fade into a dull hum. As they loaded him into a waiting vehicle to begin the long journey back toward the beach and the hospital ships, Albert Schmid finally let go. He slid into an unconsciousness that was, for the first time in many hours, peaceful. He had held the line. The boy from Philadelphia had faced the elite of the Emperor's army and had not blinked, even when the world went dark forever. The silence that followed the roar of the Ilu River was not a sudden thing. It was a slow, heavy tide that rose to drown out the echoes of the machine gun. For Sergeant Albert Schmid, the transition from the humid, blood-soaked dirt of the jungle to the sterile, rocking world of the hospital ship was a blur of disjointed sensations. There was the rhythmic sloshing of the Pacific against a steel hull, the sharp, biting scent of rubbing alcohol that replaced the sulphurous tang of cordite, and the soft, hushed murmurs of Navy corpsmen that stood in stark contrast to the guttural screams of the banzai charge. For the first time in weeks, the ground beneath him did not tremble with the impact of mortars, yet Al felt more unsettled than he ever had behind the spade grips of his .30 caliber weapon. In the darkness of his bandages, the war was over, but a new, more terrifying conflict was just beginning. By the time the transport docked in San Diego, California on October 20th, 1942, Al had undergone the first of many surgeries. The journey across the ocean had been a long, oscillating passage of pain and morphine-induced dreams. He had been admitted to the Naval Hospital, a sprawling complex of white corridors and high windows that he would never see. The surgeons were men of immense skill and few words. They worked with a quiet intensity, picking fragments of Japanese steel out of Al's face and neck like miners searching for lead in a collapsed shaft. They were honest with him, in the way military men are. One eye was gone, completely destroyed by the blast of the grenade. The other was a clouded, damaged wreck, its future uncertain. Al lay in his white-sheeted bunk, listening to the world around him. He could hear the squeak of rubber soles on the linoleum, the distant clatter of meal trays, and the low, agonizing groans of other men in the ward, men who, like him, had left pieces of themselves on the black sands of the Solomon Islands. He felt a profound sense of disgust, not for the enemy, but for himself. He was a Philadelphia kid who had made his living with his hands and his eyes, a burner of steel who understood the world through the white-hot focus of a torch. Now, he felt like a broken tool, a piece of scrap metal cast aside by the great machine of the war. "I'm through," he whispered into the stillness of the ward. "I'm just a burden now." His thoughts turned constantly to Ruth. He could still remember the way she looked under the lights of the ice rink back home, the way her smile seemed to chase away the Philadelphia winter. He thought of the engagement ring in his pocket, the small, modest diamond that represented every hope he had for a life after the Marines. The thought of it now brought him only shame. He didn't want her to see the ugly, jagged scars that ran across his face. He didn't want her to spend her life leading a blind man by the arm, her youth withered by a duty to a ghost of the man he used to be. He made a silent, grim resolution. He would tell her it was over. He would push her away before she had the chance to stay, out of pity. The turning point came not from a doctor's knife, but from a woman named Virginia Pfeiffer. She was a Red Cross worker, one of those tireless souls who moved through the wreckage of the war with a quiet, persistent grace. She had seen thousands of men like Al, heroes who felt like failures, survivors who wished they hadn't. She sat by his bed for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just occupying the space so he wouldn't feel the crushing weight of the silence. She didn't offer him empty platitudes about everything being fine. She knew it wasn't.
"You're a stubborn one, Al," she said one afternoon, her voice a soft, melodic anchor in his dark world. "You fought 800 Japanese soldiers at the river, and now you're trying to fight a girl in Philadelphia who just wants to know if you're alive."
"It's better this way, Virginia," Al replied, his voice flat. "She deserves a man who can look her in the eye. I'm just an ugly mess of stitches." Virginia didn't argue. Instead, she took out a pen and a pad of Red Cross stationery. "I'm going to write to her," she said, the scratch of the nib against the paper loud in the quiet room. "I'm not going to tell her you're a hero, and I'm not going to tell her you're a victim. I'm just going to tell her the truth. I'll tell her that you're here, that you're healing, and that you're the same stubborn Marine you were when you left." She wrote a 4-page letter to Ruth Hartley. She described the wounds with a professional clarity that stripped away the horror, replacing it with a sense of clinical reality. "He has lost one eye, and the other is seriously damaged," she wrote, her hand steady. "The doctors will not know for several months whether he will have any sight in that eye." But she also wrote of Al's spirit, of the way he still spoke of the merchants and Tulip Street, and the way he carried himself even in the depths of his recovery. She encouraged Ruth to keep writing, to be the bridge that pulled him back from the edge of his own despair. As the weeks turned into months, the silence after the storm began to fill with the sounds of a new life. Ruth's letters arrived in stacks, her words a lifeline of normalcy. She refused to accept his attempts to push her away. She wrote of the Sears department store, of the winter weather in Pennsylvania, and of her unwavering belief that they had a future together. She didn't talk to him as if he were a tragedy. She talked to him as if he were simply away on a long shift at the factory, waiting to come home. On February 18th, 1943, the hushed atmosphere of the hospital ward was interrupted by the arrival of a delegation of high-ranking officers. The war was still raging in the Pacific and in Europe, but the story of the blind Marine of Guadalcanal had already begun to capture the imagination of a nation hungry for hope. Al sat up in his bed, his chest encased in a clean hospital robe, as the citation was read aloud. "For extraordinary heroism and outstanding courage in the face of an overwhelming enemy attack." They pinned the Navy Cross to his robe. It was a heavy piece of metal, cool against his skin, a symbol of a night he wished he could forget but would always carry with him. To the world, the medal meant he was a hero, a paragon of American virtue. To Al, it was a reminder of Johnny Rivers and the way the blood felt in the mud of the Ilu. But as the officers shook his hand and the flashbulbs of the Navy photographers popped in the distance, invisible to him but warm on his skin, Al felt a shift in his own internal landscape. The disgust hadn't entirely vanished, but it had been crowded out by a burgeoning sense of duty. If he could hold a riverbank against a regiment, perhaps he could hold a life together in the dark. The journey back from the beach had been long and fractured, but as Virginia Pfeiffer folded her stationery and Ruth's latest letter sat on his nightstand, Al Schmid realized the retreat was over. He was no longer drifting in the wake of the explosion. He was standing his ground, waiting for the light to return, however dim it might be. The battle for sanity and happiness had begun, and for the first time since the grenade landed in his nest, he believed he might actually win it. To transition from the salt-sprayed deck of a hospital ship to the bustling, soot-stained streets of Philadelphia felt like a journey through two different lifetimes. In the spring of 1943, the city welcomed Sergeant Albert Schmid, not as the apprentice burner from Tulip Street, but as a legend cast in bronze and bandages. There were parades where the air hummed with the flutter of ticker tape, a sound Al's sharpened ears likened to the rustle of palm fronds, and there were speeches by men in high-collared suits who spoke of the indomitable American spirit. Al sat in the back of open-topped cars, his face a landscape of jagged, silvery scars, feeling the warmth of the sun and the press of the crowd's adulation. Yet inside, he remained a man drifting in a deep, stagnant trench. He was, by his own admission, a man disgusted. Behind the dark glasses that now shielded his ruined eyes, he imagined the looks on the faces of the people in the crowd, the pity, the wincing glances, the way they might turn away from the raw flesh the grenade had left behind. He felt like a ghost haunting his own celebration. He had told Ruth it was over. He had tried to cast her loose, believing that a girl like Babs shouldn't be tethered to a broken machine. But Ruth Hartley, the girl from the Sears department store, possessed a tenacity that rivaled any Marine on the Ilu River. She refused to take no for an answer, her love serving as the one fixed point in Al's shifting, darkened world. In April of 1943, they were married. As Al slid the ring onto her finger, the same ring he had bought with a steel mill bonus a lifetime ago, the weight of it seemed to anchor him. It was a victory more significant than the one on Guadalcanal. When their son, Albert Jr., was born in June of 1944, the cycle of life that had been so violently interrupted at the riverbank began to knit itself back together. Al was no longer just a survivor of a slaughter. He was a father, a husband, and a man with a future that didn't involve a machine gun. Yet the war would not let him go entirely. The nation needed heroes to sell war bonds and fill the seats of theaters. In 1944, Warner Brothers began production on a film titled Pride of the Marines, based on the book by Roger Butterfield. The actor John Garfield came to Philadelphia to meet Al, not as a celebrity, but as a student of a man's soul. Garfield lived in Al's home, walked the streets with him, and even spent time at the San Diego Naval Hospital to understand the heavy, sightless reality of the blind casualties. They became friends, two men from different worlds, bound by a story of fire and recovery. When the movie was released in 1945, it became a sensation. But for Al, it was a surreal experience, hearing the echoes of his own life played back through a projector he could not see. As the years drifted into the late 1940s and 50s, the spotlight faded, and Al preferred it that way. He and Ruth moved to Florida, seeking the warmth and the proximity to the Bay Pines Veterans Hospital in St. Petersburg. It was here, in the quiet salt air of the Gulf Coast, that Al Schmid finally found his peace. The disgust of his early recovery transformed into a quiet, stoic acceptance. He regained partial sight in his remaining eye, enough to navigate the world in a haze of shapes and colors, and he filled his days with the hobbies of a man who cherished the senses he still possessed. He took up the organ, his fingers finding the same rhythmic precision they once used to clear a jammed breach, but now they produced melodies instead of death. He became a ham radio operator, sitting in a small room filled with the glow of vacuum tubes and the crackle of static, reaching out into the dark to speak with voices from across the globe. It was a familiar sensation, listening for a signal in the void, but now the voices were friends, not enemies. And then there was the fishing. Al loved the water, the way it felt against the hull of a boat, a mirror to the sluggish Ilu, but without the terror. One afternoon, off Longboat Key, Al hooked into something massive. He couldn't see the silver flash of the fish as it broke the surface, but he could feel the raw, primal power of it through the rod. It was a 130-pound tarpon, a titan of the salt flats. For an hour, Al battled the fish, his muscles screaming, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. When he finally brought it alongside the boat, he didn't need to see it to know he had won. He reached down and touched the rough, prehistoric scales of the beast before letting it go. It was a different kind of tally than the 200 dead at the river, a count of life instead of loss. As the decades passed, Al often reflected on that night in August of 1942. He still heard the voice of the Japanese officer, the shrill, barking screech that had haunted his dreams for years. But the sound grew fainter as the voices of his wife and son grew louder. He understood now that he hadn't just been defending an airfield. He had been defending the right to return to a life where a Saturday afternoon fishing trip was the most important event of the week. He never considered himself a hero. He was simply a man who had been given a job to do and had done it until the light went out.
Albert Schmid passed away from bone cancer on December 2, 1982, just days before the anniversary of the attack that had changed his life. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, the white headstones standing in silent, orderly ranks, like a division at rest. The boy from the Philadelphia steel mills, who had stood his ground in a green hell and fought his way back into the light, finally lay in the quiet earth of the nation he had saved. The Ilu River was thousands of miles away, its waters long since cleared of the brass and the blood, but the legacy of the man who held the bank remained. A story not just of the steel in a gun, but of the steel in a human heart.